Good afternoon. We are here today to launch a new and very important course for the Center to Advance Palliative Care. Our lecture today will be given by Mary Gentile, who has written an extremely important book which has been widely received in the business community, and she has won many awards for this book. The book is called Giving Voice to Values. It certainly is an appropriate topic for the Center to Advance Palliative Care and for all of us who are interested in palliative care. Giving voice to value is a challenge for us in many different settings. And some of us, in fact, approach the idea of giving voice to values with some reluctance. There's a fear that we might offend. Can we speak up? Can we say what we believe? Can we interject ourselves into a situation without being offensive? Interestingly, I'd like to suggest you put that aside, because the appropriate word here is not offend. The appropriate word going forward is affirm. We know what our values are. We reflect those values in many ways. The very field of palliative care is a reflection of values. Our field would not have been created if a number of brave souls, when looking at how care was provided in various healthcare settings, did not see a need for something different, something better, patients who were unnecessarily suffering. There was a need to step forward and to say and to suggest and to plan for a new direction. This is an example of affirming of one's values, and it created our entire field. There are many other examples one could give. We may very well find ourselves in ethical situations involving our patients, their families, our departments, our faculty members, our very institution. What we need to keep in mind and be very grounded with is that we know our values. What we do is a reflection of our values. We've chosen to be at these institutions because they have values that we respect. They reflect in many ways the kinds of values that we in palliative care not only embrace, but attempt to implement on a daily basis with our patients. We hope with this course that you will begin to develop the confidence and the muscle strength, if you will, to learn to deal with these complex situations that you will find as you practice palliative care or as you deal with complex issues in your own institution. It's fundamental that you be comfortable in affirming your values. It's fundamental that you realize that this is an opportunity to continue to strengthen not only yourself and the way you care for patients, but to actually help your institution reflect the very principles and values that it was built upon. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mary Gentile.
Hello, I'm Mary Gentile. I'm the creator and director of Giving Voice to Values and a faculty member at the University of Virginia at the Darden School of Business. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you today. I wish I could be there in person. I've shared Giving Voice to Values with palliative care health caregivers in the past in Australia, and it was a wonderful group of people, and I wish I could be meeting you all in person today. What I plan to do today is to tell you a bit about Giving Voice to Values, or GVV as I call it. It's an innovative approach, a new approach to values-driven leadership development. I'm not going to be here to tell you what your values should be. I know you know what your values are. There are things like respect for patient autonomy and for your colleagues, compassion and compassionate care, and also the ability to communicate effectively around your compassion. And fairness, and understanding of structural racism and biases, and being able to communicate effectively around those sorts of topics as well. You know those values, and in fact, those are the values that, some of the values that drove you or drew you to the profession you have. You also understand the pressures that you face that sometimes conflict with those values. Business pressures, for example. Or pressures around hierarchy and obedience to authority. So I don't really feel the need to tell you what those values should be. I know you have them. I also know you experience the conflicts. What GVV is about is actually hopefully helping you find more effective, comfortable, natural, successful ways to voice and act on those values when you face conflicts in your profession. I always tell people, if you don't remember anything else about giving voice to values, I hope that you'll remember this, that giving voice to values is about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to values-driven leadership. So instead of asking and answering the question, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. It's an important question. But rather, GVV is about asking and answering the question, once you know what the right thing to do is, how can you get it done successfully, effectively? What do you need to say? To whom and in what sequence? What will the pushback or the objections, we call those the reasons and rationalizations, what will they be? And then what will you say? And what kinds of data do you need to gather to express your positions effectively? How do you need to frame the challenges that you're trying to address or the problem that you're trying to address? And is this a one-off situation where you just need to have a conversation with one person? Or is this more of a systemic issue where really the approach is going to need to be systemic? So you may need to be thinking incrementally and in a staged and tactical way and building a set of allies, a sort of coalition. So GVV is actually about rehearsing, pre-scripting, practicing, peer coaching these strategies. It's less of a philosophy experience, and it's more of a really practical, action-oriented experience. Now, GVV grew out of my own frustration. I've been working in the field of business education for several decades. I spent 10 years at Harvard Business School. I was at Babson College, and I'm now at the University of Virginia. I also consulted to companies and other organizations and other business schools. And I was discouraged with the way we approached values and ethics and leadership. We tended to approach it as if it was entirely a cognitive problem, as if all we needed was some sort of decision-making framework, a kind of black box. And you put all the information in one end and the right, ethical, responsible answer would come out the other end, and then we're done. I call it the preach and pretend measure or approach. We preach to you about what's right, and then we pretend that you can do it. And I was finding, both with my business students and with organizational managers and leaders that I worked with, that they, found it kind of pedantic, a little bit patronizing and condescending, and certainly not practical. And so for all those reasons and a number of others, I became discouraged with this endeavor. And I really took a step back from this work. This was about, at this point, it was 20 years ago. I took a step back and I had a number of experiences, and I also started to be exposed to new research that actually led me to framing a different approach, the giving voice to values approach to ethics and values-driven leadership development. So as I said, I started to come across a lot of research. So I think the first thing that sort of triggered this thought were a couple studies I was exposed to when I was still at Harvard Business School. It was two different studies by two different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, and they both decided independently that they were going to do some qualitative research to try and understand how people act with moral conviction in times of high stakes, high risk. And so they both independently identified a population who's often referred to as rescuers from World War II as the kinds of people that they would talk to. And so they did these in-depth interviews with these folks. These are people who put their own lives at stake to help others during the Holocaust. And so they tried to understand, did they have any common personal experiences, family background, religious background, education, whatever. And they found a number of characteristics, as that kind of research tends to do. But there was one factor that really stuck with me, probably because I was an educator. And they said that the kinds of people who acted with this kind of conviction in these risky situations all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience of with someone more senior to them. So a boss or a teacher, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of being asked the question, what would you do if? And then certain kinds of moral conflicts were presented. And so they'd had the experience of literally rehearsing, pre-scripting their responses. And this experience was both at the cognitive level, but also at the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they actually identified the value or values that mattered to them and put an articulation to it, the words, the script. But at a behavioral level, they had the experience of literally voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them, who stood in as proxy for the kind of person or persons they might need to communicate with in the actual situation. So when I came across this research, I thought it was really interesting, this idea of rehearsal and pre-scripting and peer coaching. So I started to do some exploration. This was about 12 years ago now. There was starting to be a lot of research, there's more now, that suggested that behavior, that practice and rehearsal were very effective ways to impact people's behavior. I'm sure you're familiar with some of this kinds of research. In the fields of social psychology, there's research on habit formation, for example, or there's a group of scholars who study what's known as positive deviance. They study people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive way. The folks who do that research have a great phrase. This is their phrase, not mine. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that was kind of provocative. And then, of course, there's been a lot of research that's gotten a lot of attention in the field of cognitive neurosciences. And there's research there that I'm sure you're familiar with around brain plasticity, around creating new neural pathways. But the research I'm going to mention actually comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. And I'm just going to tell you a little story. Back when I was first working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. Now, I'd never felt the need to take a self-defense class until I went to work at Harvard Business School. Perhaps they are connected. But at any rate, I looked around Boston. There were a lot of these courses. They all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves. So it's fist to bridge of nose, or heel to instep, or knee to groin, and they have you practice these moves in the air. And the idea is, now if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do, right? But there was one course that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model. So they would still teach you all those moves and you rehearse them in the air. But then once you knew the moves, they would actually bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, like the Michelin Man. And they'd line us all up and we would take turns getting attacked. And then we could use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was a little ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But as the course went on, week after week, I would be there and he would come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what hold he was going to use. So it was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea, as they explained it to us, was built on this research called specific state muscle memory. And those of you who are athletes will be quite familiar with this. But the idea is that if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze, your body will remember. So one day I'm in this class and I'm laying on my back on the floor because I have failed to protect myself. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default behavior, a default to voice, but not just to speaking up, speaking truth to power? Because in the research I was doing, in the exploration I was doing, talking to many, many people about how and when they had acted effectively on their values or had not, I was learning that the people who did this effectively, it was rarely a matter of, calling someone out as a villain. It was much more often more nuanced, more tactical, more strategic, more sophisticated. And so I was thinking, could you create a default to informed voice? Because the other thing I was learning is that the kinds of objections or resistance that people face, the reasons and rationalizations, are fairly predictable. They're powerful, but they're not bulletproof, but they're very difficult to respond to in the moment. It's a sort of emotionally charged moment. And so I was thinking, could we unpack these, practice, rehearse, create a new kind of moral muscle? This was also informed by research that was coming out around how people actually encounter values conflicts, that we tend to respond automatically, emotionally, almost unconsciously, and then we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do or why it was the only thing we could do. And so I realized that simply focusing on intellectual analysis wasn't going to rewire that automatic emotional connection. What we really needed to do was to practice to create that rewired connection. So we created a new pedagogy, a new teaching technology for this. We call it the GVV thought experiment, where we use scenarios, examples that are relevant to the profession or the organization that the individual is in or the role they play. But instead of ending with the question, what would you do when you're confronted with this ethical dilemma, we actually end with a protagonist who has decided what they know, that they know what the right thing to do is. And the question is, how could they be effective? What would they need to say and do? What would be the objections, the rationalizations they would encounter? How would they reframe the challenge? What data could they use? How do they build an argument? How do they bring in allies? How do you build the relationship? It's all about communication, influence, negotiation, persuasion. So we created many, many pieces of material, hundreds of these scenarios and exercises to build the skills. And we have books and all of these materials, online modules and MOOCs, etc. And this approach is now being used all over the world, literally all 7 continents. It's used obviously in education, but it's also being used in many corporations and in NGOs. We've worked with healthcare organizations on several continents, and both physicians and nurses, etc. And so I'm going to wrap this up because I know we want to get to some questions and answers, but I think you're probably figuring out that the whole idea behind giving voice to values is simply a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done effectively? And of course, we have all kinds of tools and skills that and protocols that we share with you, but the real special sauce is in your own knowledge and experience of your context and your profession. But we also say that GVV is based on 3 other reframes, 3 flips, 3 reversals. We've reversed what it is we think we're talking about when we talk about ethics and values. We've reversed who it is we think we're talking to, and we've reversed how we're having the conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about, it used to be that people would always say to me, Mary, if you're trying to talk about ethics and values, don't talk about the so-called clear-cut, right, wrong, black and white issues. Focus on the gray issues. They're more challenging. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. But I've actually changed my mind. I find that if we focus only on the gray issues, we spend all our time debating what the right thing to do is, right? How many angels dance on the head of a pin? So instead, we focus on the so-called clear-cut, black and white issues, the issues where most of us, not everyone, but most of us would agree, that's clearly over the line. It's clearly abusive or fraudulent, unfair. So that we can get to the discussion of action. So that's the first flip. We're focusing on those more clear-cut issues. And our theory is that if you get better at dealing with those, you've actually gone a long way to improve the organizational functioning and your own personal, professional functioning, but you also will get better at talking about the so-called gray issues. And the other flip is, who we think we're talking to. It used to be I'd go into an organization and they'd say, Mary, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples, right? I actually think of our audience differently, and this is based on some research by the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton. So when we think about the organization, we think of it as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who would say, I'll do whatever it takes to maximize my own self-interest, right? Nobody falls into one of those categories all the time, but these are people who would identify that as their key motivator. And the other tail end of the bell curve are the people who identify as idealists. And we define that as folks who will say, I'll always try and act on my values, regardless on my self-interest, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. What we assume, though, that the larger group falls under the bell, and we call them pragmatists. I put myself there. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I'll never pay a price. It's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll succeed. It simply means I think I have a shot. Now, if you think of your audience that way, I don't think I really have the power to change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I want them to be more competent, more skillful. But we're really focused on the pragmatists, and we want to give them the skills, the literal scripts, the rehearsal and peer coaching practice, the positive examples, to be who they already want to be at their best. So we're not trying to change them, we're trying to enable them, right? And our premise is that if enough of the idealists and the pragmatists became more skillful at this and more comfortable and likely to voice and act, it changes the water that the opportunists swim in. So the calculus that they do to determine what is in their own self-interest will have to change. And the final flip is how we do all this, and I've already told you that. Instead of asking what's right, we ask you, how do you get the right thing done? And we give you examples and tools and rehearsal in peer coaching to get more effective at that. So that's GVV in a nutshell. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about questions or suggestions you may have about its usefulness and applications in your own work. I can share with you how we've shared it in other organizations and what they've done and the impact that they've had. And really, thank you very much for the opportunity to share GVV with you. And thank you for the work you do, which is so important.